Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my February wrap-up. You know, for a second there, I thought this might be a short wrap-up, but then I rallied in the back half of the month and ended up reading 12 books. So let's not waste any time and just get started. The first book I finished in February was my e-galley of the Obake Code by Makane Yamamoto, which came out from Harper Voyager on February 17th. For some reason, this is billed as a standalone sci-fi caper, but it definitely involves characters from the author's debut, Hamajang Luck, and takes place after the events of that book. So if you're at all interested in Hamajang Luck, I would recommend reading that one first, as this book definitely spoils what happens in that heist. With that said, this is another high-stakes sci-fi heist following Malia, who is an incredibly talented hacker known as the Obake. After her last job, she's pretty much set for life and has everything she could possibly want, except she's not exactly taking well to civilian life. Out of sheer boredom, she decides to start rigging cybernetic prize fights to make some extra cash on the side. And when she gets caught by one of the most notorious crime bosses, she is conscripted into a scheme where her job is to take down a local politician whose platform is built on cleaning up the streets in order to make way for this crime boss's operations to thrive once again. Worth noting, Malia is a queer native Hawaiian. The love interest Sol is queer, non-binary, and Latine coded, and another member of the crew, Tatiana, is canonically Aro Ace. Content warnings for allusions to off-page child abduction, child abuse, human trafficking, and human experimentation, some depictions of graphic injury and violence, some depictions of chronic pain, and some use of ableist language, and some sexual content. While I wouldn't say I enjoyed this book as much as Hamajang Luck, I did still enjoy it. I'll never say no to a sleek, sexy, dangerous heist, and I think on that level, this is definitely an entertaining story to read. It's really easy to get invested in the unfolding plot. The gritty criminal underworld aboard this space station is really interesting to read about, and there's also a bit of underlying sapphic romance, which of course is delicious. What I appreciate about both this book and Hamajang Luck is that there's a moral imperative underlying these heists. The stories aren't just about undertaking crime for crime's sake, but because the characters are trying to gain some semblance of agency under corrupt systems, or because they're attempting to rebalance the scales in response to some kind of injustice. So I appreciate the way this story explores systems and networks of corruption, how those systems are built in such a way that they're integral to maintaining society's status quo, and how poking at their foundations threatens to make the entire system collapse. I also think the story is really clever in paralleling this concept of code, as in computer code and programming language, with the concept of maintaining a strict moral code that guides the course of our lives and the choices we make. In the same way that Malia breaks into computer code and reconfigures it to do whatever she wants, she's also having to consider whether it's worth the risk to break into her own moral code, which tells her that she's safest when she's by herself and that she shouldn't form any attachments or let anyone get too close. So I like that those two pieces of the story are in conversation with each other in really interesting ways, and I also appreciate the story's commentary on how willfully isolating ourselves and shutting out opportunities to build community and networks of safety is how we end up doing the work of the system on its behalf. Where the story falls short, at least for me, is in the character dynamics and relationship dynamics. It has all the action and intrigue and high stakes you need for an interesting heist, but it doesn't necessarily have that same level of emotion and interiority to really back that up on the page. And also the heist itself is a little bit lackluster at times. I wish there was more suspense. I wish the characters had to work a little bit harder to achieve what they're trying to achieve. Things are just a little bit too neat and a little bit too convenient at times, if that makes sense. But even with that said, there's still a lot of worthwhile things happening in this story. I would recommend checking out both of this author's books if they sound at all interesting to you, but in the end I gave this one 3.5 stars. On perhaps the most different note possible, after that I listened to Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. The audio edition I listened to was read by Amy Lou Wood with an introduction read by Kristen Atherton. This is a classic piece of British literature set in the late 1700s following the new tenant of Thrushcross Grange, Lockwood, who after getting lost in the moors is forced to seek shelter at Wuthering Heights, the home of his landlord. And while staying there, he discovers the fraught history of the estate and the twisted family ties between those occupying its grounds. One of the servants at Wuthering Heights tells him the tragic tale of an intense forbidden love between the foundling Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw, who was ultimately forced to choose between a passionate love with Heathcliff or a life of comfort and nobility with Edgar Linton, and the horrifying events that were set into motion when she ultimately had to surrender to the expectations of her class. Content warnings for some use of outdated racist epithets, experienced racism, colorism, classism, and ableism, brief allusions to child abuse and marital abuse, including marital rape, brief allusions to animal cruelty, depictions of physical assault and violence, explorations of parent death and grief, and some allusions to depressive episodes, suicide, and suicidal thoughts. Interestingly enough, this was actually my first exposure to Wuthering Heights, and yes, I did read it in preparation for the 2026 adaptation, which was certainly an experience, but also not the subject of this video. But I was actually surprised by how enthralled I was with this story. It's hard to say that I enjoyed it because it's a fundamentally unenjoyable story populated by horrible characters acting horribly and doing horrible things to each other, but at the same time, I also really respect it for that callousness. I really do give this story credit for its bold audacity and for the fact that it was so incredibly disruptive, especially for the time period and social climate it was first published within. Not only is it a deeply unsettling story, but its format of telling a story within a story and also sort of emulating the feel of oral storytelling was also very much not the norm for this time period, which is to say nothing of the absolutely volatile and hateful relationship dynamics between these so-called romantic heroes. Those violent ups and downs, those heated points of tension and explosive passion with nowhere to go, were a huge part of what kept me invested in the story. I found Heathcliff especially to be a really fascinating anchor point because of his otherness, because he is this undefinable, unclassable person of color who seems to exist entirely outside of class and outside of society itself. Make no mistake, his actions and choices are heinous. They are all but completely irredeemable, but I feel like that's also the point. I feel like the story is functioning as a deep character study of how his indefinable sense of otherness is the root of all his anger and his sorrow, especially in how it acts as a barrier between not only himself and the world, but really between himself and the life that he so desperately wants but is not allowed to have in so many ways. To me, it's very much a story about how the strictures of society, again, especially during this time period, have the power to fundamentally break people and sever them from their own sense of humanity. It's about how when there's no place for that kind of pain to go, it festers, it replicates itself, it becomes transmuted from something we passively absorb into something we actively inflict. This is a story that speaks to unchecked generational trauma, how when we lack the language and ability to express the horrific things we've been through, we then knowingly or unknowingly feed into those same cycles. It's about characters who, when denied their own happiness and agency, become determined to make sure that, in turn, no one else around them is able to experience or access their own humanity or happiness. The whirlwind drama and all-consuming obsessive nature of the connection between the central characters is all but impossible to look away from. In the end, I'm glad I took the time to familiarize myself with this classic, and I think I would give it a strong 3.75 stars. Once I finished that, I picked up my finished copy of The Great Disillusionment of Nick and Jay by Ryan Douglas. I believe I was sent this unsolicited from the publisher, but it came out at the end of January from HarperCollins. This is a queer YA reimagining of The Great Gatsby, but instead of using the same narrative framework as the original classic, it's exploring what it would look like if Nick and Jay were two queer black teens living in Harlem, and what would happen if West Egg was a private integrated school for boys where they first met. The main character Nick is forced to flee his home in Oklahoma after his father falls victim to a horrific race riot. So he reaches out to some distant relatives in Harlem who agree to take him in, and it isn't until he hears about the prestigious West Egg Academy and the opportunities it promises young black boys like himself that he's inspired to finally take back his life. But at the academy, he finds that the promise of an integrated education is more of a theory than a practice, and he still has to grapple with a lot of the same prejudices that he thought he left behind in Oklahoma. And his secret but growing feelings for the founder's charismatic son, Jay Gatsby Jr., only makes acclimating himself even more complicated. Content warnings for explorations of parent death and grief, experienced racism including segregation, assault, violence, gun violence, arson, and massacres, and some graphic depictions of police brutality, injury, and racist violence. As a retelling, I really like the fresh perspective this story brings to a familiar classic, especially one that's been retold countless times. Obviously, The Great Gatsby has a lot of queer subtext, and there are many retellings out there that excavate the queerness of Jay and Nick's relationship, but the fact that this story positions those characters as queer black teenagers living through the Harlem Renaissance is an angle we haven't seen this narrative through before. So it's bringing something new and interesting to the table. I also appreciate that there's enough touchstones, references, and parallels to the original text that readers in the know can easily identify and anchor themselves to, but at the same time, because this is a drastically different take on that narrative, it also leaves the story open to going completely new places. I also like that this story is set during an underrepresented time in US history, certainly a time period that we don't see explored often enough in YA spaces. I respect that it doesn't pull any punches in regards to depicting the horrific kinds of racism that black communities were contending with during this time, from segregation and Jim Crow to police brutality and deadly race riots. There's also nuance to how the interplay between race and privilege is depicted, especially because Nick and Jay not only come from drastically different social classes and backgrounds, but also because Jay has passing privilege and can navigate through the world in a very different way because of his status as someone who is lighter skinned and mixed race. So even though these two characters are both racialized as black and go to the same school and have been promised that they'll receive the same quality education, they're having two very different experiences, which really goes to show how the quote-unquote Black experience is not and never has been a monolithic experience. So I really respect the story's willingness to go there and to have those conversations. I love the spirit of rebellion and resistance underlying the characters' respective journeys, and I think it's great that this story is showing young readers that marginalized folks especially cannot afford to measure our worth and value using the oppressor's measuring stick. So I think the fact that these characters are brave enough to carve out their own spaces, find strength in their communities, and aren't afraid to fight for what they really believe in is a really compelling and important part of the story. All that said, I do think the story starts out really strong, but it kind of goes off the rails by the end, and it takes some really big swings in terms of character morals and motivations that I don't think quite pay off. It kind of feels like the story has a little bit of an identity crisis towards the middle going into the end. It's like the story doesn't quite know what it wants to be, and in trying to be everything and do everything, it has to sacrifice character and quality in some sense. But again, I do really appreciate this story as a dramatically new take on a familiar classic, and I still gave it a solid 3.75 stars. After that, I listened to my ALC of A Lady for All Seasons by TJ Alexander. Vintage Books kindly sent me a galley, and I was granted access to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by Ian Slater. This is another queer Regency romance from TJ Alexander. It's a loose companion to A Gentleman's Gentleman and takes place after the events of that book. This story is about a single noblewoman named Verbena who is dangerously close to entering spinsterhood, which she would gladly do if her father hadn't wasted away the family fortune, including her dowry, and now the continued survival of her family depends on her making a suitable marriage match. She comes up with what she thinks is a brilliant plan when she realizes that one of her dear friends, Etienne, is in danger of being ruined and exposed as a queer man. So she suggests that they marry each other, not for love, but for convenience, and then they'd both be free to explore other queer dalliances. But a mysterious up-and-coming poet known as Flora Whitcomb begins publishing poems hinting that she's on to their scheme. And obviously, if Verbena wants to protect her reputation, she'll have no choice but to confront this poet face to face. Also worth noting, Verbena is queer, and Flora, who was also known as William, is canonically bigender and uses multiple names and pronouns throughout the story depending on how they're feeling, how they're presenting, and who they're with. Content warnings for experienced classism and sexism, allusions to homophobia and transphobia, depictions of fire-related trauma and injury, and some explicit sexual content. Listen, I love a good Regency romance, and like I said when I read A Gentleman's Gentleman, it's exceedingly rare for us to get these classic kinds of historical romances told from queer and trans perspectives, especially as written by queer and trans authors. And so I have so much love for TJ Alexander as they continue bringing our stories into those spaces. If you love messiness, all kinds of mixed signals, the constant ruination of the best laid plans, and wacky romantic schemes gone horribly awry, this story has all of those things in spades. There are some very classic romantic tropes explored in this story, namely marriage of convenience and mistaken identity, that I think are played with in really interesting ways, especially considering the fact that we don't often get to see those genre conventions with a trans twist. I will say, sometimes the whole crossed wires and schemes on top of schemes thing got a bit out of hand, at least for my taste. It kind of gets to a point where you wish these two characters would just talk to each other and realize that they're trying to accomplish the very same thing. They're on the same page, they're just coming at it from two very different directions. But of course, if they just talk to each other like normal humans, then there would be no drama, no intrigue, and ultimately no story. And especially for Flora, as a trans and bigender person, it's already a huge risk to be pursuing Verbena as a feminine presenting person, much less as someone who inhabits multiple genders. So obviously that's not something she can just easily share, because that would very well put her life and her safety at risk. So I definitely have empathy for the characters in that sense. I understand that they can't just come clean with each other until that relationship and until that trust has really been tested and withstood a significant amount of time. But even taking that into consideration, I think your mileage may vary when it comes to how disconnected these two characters can be. I have to admit, I also wasn't completely bought into the romance itself, because it becomes very intense very quickly after only a few short interactions. I wish there was some more emotional connective tissue and time spent between the characters before they really set their hearts on each other, especially considering the lengths they're willing to go to in order to try and be together some way, somehow. I just needed to believe it and feel it a little bit more. But thematically, I really appreciate what the story is doing, especially in the ways it's exploring how changing and being changeable doesn't mean that a person is inherently unhappy or discontent. If anything, it means that they're even more driven to capture and express happiness, and they're not afraid to keep exploring the boundaries of what happiness and wholeness and contentment movement can look like. There's also this through line about both Verbena and Flora being very bold, outspoken, independent people who can imagine and inhabit so many different paths and versions of themselves, but at the same time, they allow the expectations of society to limit their imaginations in some ways. And over the course of the story, they're really trying to reclaim and repurpose that boldness for themselves. So there's definitely a lot to enjoy here. Again, if you're a fan of Regency romances and you want to see romances set during that time period that play with familiar themes and tropes in really interesting, queered ways, then you'll most likely enjoy this. Taking everything into consideration, personally, I would give it 4 stars. Then I just could not shake this queer historical kick I was on, so I listened to This Wretched Beauty by Elle Grenier. I was sent a finished copy by Fievel and Friends as part of a book tour with Colored Pages Book Tours, and I was also given access to the audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, which is read by Jeanette Lelachore. It also came out recently on February 17th. This is the latest installment in Macmillan's Remix Classic series, which is a series of YA books retelling classic stories from marginalized perspectives. This is a queer and trans reimagining of the picture of Dorian Gray, where Dorian is a young trans femme non-binary person. The story is set in 1867 and follows Dorian, who is the young heir to their family estate, but in order to claim it, they've been forcibly estranged from their father and forced to live with their grandfather, who is extremely controlling and even abusive. One night, Dorian meets a talented young painter named Basil, who immediately recognizes Dorian as his new muse and invites Dorian to sit for a portrait, which they agree to do. And it's only upon seeing the incredible likeness that Basil is somehow able to capture, along with the experience of Basil introducing them to a world full of molly houses and drag performers, that Dorian is able to imagine completely new possibilities for their life. Also worth noting, this story highlights a T for T romance, and both characters are trans non-binary, one being femme of center and the other being masc of center, and neither of them identify in a strictly binary sense. Content warnings for experienced homophobia and transphobia, including internalized self-loathing and use of queerphobic slurs, incidental incidents of self-harm and masochism, some non-graphic references to depressive episodes and suicidal ideation, depictions of an abusive grandparent-grandchild relationship, including emotional and physical abuse, references to parental death and grief, and instances of infidelity and implied sexual extortion. When I tell you this book rocked my fucking world, I mean that with everything I have. I hadn't even read The Picture of Dorian Gray at the time of picking up this book, but I did have a working knowledge of that text and also of Oscar Wilde's personal history, but even without that full context, I still think this story offers so much. I think this book masterfully uses the already incredibly queer blueprint that is The Picture of Dorian Gray to tremendous effect, transmuting the narrative into something even more queer, even bolder, even messier, and even more tangled in some ways. Instead of narcissism or vanity, Dorian's obsession with their own portrait in this rendition of the story really speaks to a longing for innocence and possibility that they feel like they can't truly access. So the reason why they're so fixated on a version of themselves that never changes is because they feel suffocated by the oncoming reality of manhood, of being forced to present as a man in clear-cut, predetermined ways deemed acceptable by society that ultimately don't resonate. Their youth, in contrast to that, represents a time in their life when they didn't have to make those choices. In that way, the story isn't so much about fearing death or mortality, but rather about the fear of growing into something or someone that we don't recognize, and how desolate the future seems when we don't have the vocabulary or imagination to create a reality where we are seen as ourselves, rather than as an imagined ideal that we can never hope to recreate. And I really appreciate how this book is able to explore Dorian's story with compassion and nuance. Their journey is not easy. There's a lot of pain along the way. Dorian makes a lot of really horrifying decisions in a futile attempt to protect themselves and prevent themselves from being seen in all their imperfection. But even with all of that, the story is far from hopeless. There's a really great message in here about how being imperfect doesn't mean that we're flawed and doesn't mean that we're broken. It's merely a sign that we are perhaps the scariest and most vulnerable thing imaginable, which is human. I really cannot emphasize enough how incredible this story is. The prose is stunning. The use of language and imagery is remarkable. It takes the framework of Dorian Gray and builds upon it in really fascinating, refreshing ways. It really did strike a chord with me, and for that I had to give it 5 stars. After that, I switched over to some middle grades, starting with the incredibly human Henson Blayze by Derek Barnes. This story is set in a small town in Mississippi where 13-year-old Henson Blayze has become a local sensation as an up-and-coming football superstar who is so talented that he's been invited to play varsity football for the local high school, and the first game of the season is quickly approaching. This is a predominantly white southern town, and in the lead up to the game, all of the townspeople people could not be more excited and supportive. But when a horrific incident involving racist violence and police brutality prompts Henson to speak out about injustice and openly question whether he wants to continue playing football, he quickly learns that he may not be as beloved to the townsfolk as he once thought. Content warnings for explorations of racism, including references to slavery, massacre, lynching, anti-Indigenous violence, colonial violence, and racist slurs, some references to parent death and grief, and brief depictions of police brutality and graphic injury. I'm just going to start by saying that I did not love this. I really wanted to. I think this story has so much potential. I think it has an incredibly worthwhile idea at its core. This conversation about the public obsession with Black bodies for sport, for financial gain, for consumption, for entertainment is one that desperately needs to be had. But I think, among other things, this story ultimately lacks focus. I think, at least for me, the issue is that this story wants to have an important conversation about the expendability of Black bodies, the public shift where Black excellence is no longer a marker of the extraordinary, but rather a replacement for the baseline expectation we hold for all quote-unquote worthwhile Black existence. And I think the story needs to be grounded if it wants to effectively have those discussions. The problem is that in attempting to illustrate those points, everything is far too exaggerated to be fully believable. The highs are too high and the lows are too low, and the switch between the two happens too quickly to feel anything other than whiplash. And that's not to say that people don't act this way, that people don't become fanatical and almost mindless when it comes to worshiping sports and athletes in this country, but it just doesn't feel grounded in any kind of realism in more ways than one. Ultimately, it just feels like the intended message of the story and the soapbox of it all overpowers the plot, instead of the plot and characterization working together to impart a message. There's also a bit of magic or surrealism to the story, which is an interesting touch, but I found the origins of that magic to be a little bit questionable, and because the magic was aiding an already privileged, already powerful family, I didn't find it to be as impactful as it could have been. But again, I do appreciate the conversations this story is attempting to have, and I think they're very much worthwhile. There were also these interludes where characters in the story were telling their own stories about the town, about Henson's family, about the history of the region. I thought that was a really cool way to impart a sense of local mythology and myth-making to the story, but ultimately I could only give this about 3 stars. I followed that up with All the Blues in the Sky by Renee Watson. It's very belated, but I did in fact receive a galley for this book from the publisher at the ALA conference back in 2024. This is a middle grade novel in verse about a young girl named Sage whose 13th birthday quickly goes from being a joyous occasion to the worst day of her life when her best friend is suddenly killed in a hit-and-run incident. Now she spends the majority of her days attending a counseling group with a bunch of other girls who have also endured the recent loss of someone they love. And it's through navigating that group and the unpredictability of her own grief that Sage is gradually learning how to hold and express both sadness and unexpected happiness in her life. Content warnings for depictions of vehicular manslaughter, explorations of child death and grief, mentions of cancer, and brief references to experienced racism and police brutality. Honestly, Renee Watson never misses. I've never read a bad book from her, and I sincerely doubt I ever will. I have so much respect for what she's doing in this book especially. It's a difficult, heavy, heartbreaking story, but it's touching on something that a lot of young folks have to navigate or will have to navigate at some point in their life. I think we don't talk enough with our young people about death and grief and about how complicated it can be and how it can show up in our lives in ways that look different for everyone. And I really appreciate this story for giving Sage the space to feel all of her rage and confusion and sadness. This is a really beautiful story about accepting that sorrow and happiness, grief and love can exist in our lives at the same time. It's about reckoning with the fact that carrying on with our lives, making new memories, discovering new things, isn't doing a disservice to the ones we've lost, but rather honoring all the ways they've taught us to accept and embrace love. I think that's what I appreciate most about this story, the way it shows young readers that it's such an incredible thing to love someone and to be loved by someone. And even though we don't get to keep the ones we love forever, taking that leap will always be worth the risk. Again, Renee Watson is just a master of verse. She's able to take a very heavy topic and make it accessible, make it real, make it hopeful. I thought this was great. I would definitely recommend it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. The next 2 books I read I'm going to talk about together because they're from the same series, but I was finally able to finish off the Convergence saga by reading We Are the Crisis and A Ruin Great and Free by Cadwell Turnbull. I listened to the audiobooks, which are both read by Dion Graham. Obviously, I'm not going to spoil the series by sharing the plot of these last two books, but very generally speaking, this is a sci-fantasy horror series about what happens when humans realize that monsters do in fact exist, and that we've been unknowingly living in their midst for generations. That's exactly what happens in the first book when Lena's brother is horrifically shot and killed by police, and when the surveillance footage is released, it ends up going viral because it shows her brother shifting into a monster just before his final moments. That sort of sets things in motion, and the rest of the trilogy is really exploring how this revelation might impact and restructure our society in every imaginable way. All the books in this series tend to contain the same kind of content, so broadly speaking, content warnings for both of these books include depictions of racism and racist violence, explorations of grief and loss, experienced hate crimes, and graphic depictions of death, blood, gore, injury, and violence. No Gods, No Monsters is truly an S-tier fantasy novel that's lived rent-free in my head every single day since I first read it back in 2023. I have been wanting to close out the series for quite some time, and overall I did really enjoy the time I spent with both of these last two books. Just a quick note before I go any further, I learned while reading the third book that Cadwell Turnbull's other book, The Lesson, takes place in the same world and timeline, and the events of that book take place sometime between books 2 and 3. So if you want to be a real completionist, then the ideal reading order is No Gods, No Monsters, We Are the Crisis, The Lesson, then A Ruin Great and Free. But obviously, as someone who didn't read that book where it fits in chronologically, I can also attest that it's not necessary in order to appreciate or understand what the trilogy is doing. But since I know that now, I figured I would pass that knowledge on to you to do with as you will. Putting that aside, I have such a deep appreciation for this trilogy now that I understand its endgame and its trajectory. It's bold, it's different, it's not afraid to take a lot of narrative risks, and it trusts the reader to go along for the ride without needing their hand held. And I just think it leaves the audience with a lot of worthwhile questions and ideas. The monsters in this series are obviously metaphorical stand-ins for the marginalized, for the proverbial societal other, which opens up space for the series to ask really provocative questions about the nature of humans, which we see as a baseline of normality, in contrast to the nature of those we see as monsters. Do monsters have a monopoly on monstrosity, or are humans even more inherently monstrous in their own ways? In what ways are marginalized and vulnerable communities forced to become monsters or act in ways that are deemed monstrous in seeking their own survival and safety, in forcibly resisting oppressive and colonial violence? Is the concept of monstrosity something we can only conceptualize depending on its proximity to the continued stability of oppressive structures of power and oppressive systems? Are the actions and communities that threaten the powers that be considered monstrous because they're actually evil, or because they threaten to overthrow the status quo? These are the questions the trilogy is grappling with at length, and I really appreciate the work it's doing in that sense. I also love the way each book is structured, almost like a series of interconnected short stories following a lot of different characters who have very different stakes in this societal upheaval. Some are humans, some are monsters, some are something in between, and I think that kaleidoscopic approach is really effective. I will say, for me, We Are the Crisis does suffer a little bit from second book syndrome. I also found myself wishing there was much more differentiation between book 1 and book 2, especially in terms of plot structure and flow. It kind of felt like it was doing more of the same of what we saw in book 1, but in a less effective way, and overall it just felt like perfunctory connective tissue between books 1 and 3. The fact of the matter is that you could not go from book 1 to book 3. This could not be condensed to a duology. There needs to be something in between. But again, I think that middle book could have been stronger and much more effective. And for A Ruin Great and Free, I feel like the pacing was ever so slightly off, especially towards the end. For me, the climactic action happens a bit prematurely, and then there's a long come down afterwards, a very sustained section of falling action, an overly drawn out denouement in my opinion. So I think both books could have been a little bit tighter in their own ways. But make no mistake, this is still exceptional work from Cadwell Turnbull. It's an amazing series that I would wholeheartedly recommend. Respectively, I gave books 2 and 3 4.25 stars and 4.5 stars. After that, I went back to verse by listening to King of the Neuroverse by Idris Goodwin. I checked out the audiobook from my library, which is read by the author himself. This is a YA novel in verse set during the 90s about a young black boy with ADHD named Purnell, who's having to attend summer school for the third summer in a row. Not because he's unintelligent, but because he can't connect with the material and the curriculum just doesn't match the way he learns. But this summer is going to be different because the only thing he cares about is becoming the Cypher King, the leader of the lunchroom's impromptu rap circles, where his free-flowing ADH mind mind actually gives him an edge. But he's also dealing with a really crappy English teacher who seems to have it out for him. His parents are pressuring him to see a doctor to properly diagnose him, and if he doesn't find a way to pull himself together, he won't just lose the title of Cypher King, he'll also lose his last chance to graduate. Content warnings for experienced bullying, harassment, and ableism, including internalized ableism and some use of ableist language. I thought this was really good. The choice to tell this particular story in verse was incredibly smart, not only because freestyle rap is a key component of the story and there are scenes where the characters are literally communing in verse, but also because the way this character makes sense of the world and the way his mind works is also through verse. So the format is very intentional, it's very well thought out, it serves an in-story purpose, but also bolsters the characterization of the narrator, and I think it's a great use of first-person narration as well, because Purnell has a very distinct, strong, personable voice. There's a great sense of underlying humor to his narrative voice. His mind is very chaotic in its own way, but getting to see the world through his perspective also shows how there's a kind of logic to the chaos. I really appreciate the project of this story, which is about destigmatizing disability in the classroom and showing how people with learning disabilities or invisible disabilities are not lazy, incapable, or unintelligent. Even though we know so much more about learning disabilities now, there are still those misconceptions and there's still that stigma. And so many classrooms are still structured in an inaccessible way that excludes so many and leaves so many students, especially students of color, on the outside looking in. So again, I appreciate this book for taking an incredibly nuanced and complex topic and making it human, giving an incredibly endearing and charismatic voice to that experience. I do wish there was a bit more emotional catharsis to the story. I feel like the main conflict is resolved in a way that feels a bit like a cop-out. I'm not going to spoil it, obviously, but I feel like some of the air was taken out of the story's metaphorical sails towards the end. But I would still give this 4 stars. Speaking of wind and sails, I then picked up my Patreon pick for February, and my patrons voted for me to read The Ballad of Jacquotte Delahaye by Brian E. Cameron. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Angel Pian. This is a queer, swashbuckling pirate adventure inspired by a somewhat real-life historical figure who was said to be one of the few female pirate captains to ever sail the Caribbean seas. The story begins in Santo Domingo, where Jacquotte is an up-and-coming shipwright who dreams of seeing the world, but her alcoholic French father insists on keeping her grounded in town and is determined to keep her close. But one night when she happens to witness a horrifying coup firsthand, she and her brother are forced to flee their home and go on the run with a motley crew of refugees. It's not long before Jacquotte and her companions are captured by the infamous Black Hand and forced into indentured servitude aboard his ship, but when he hatches a dangerous scheme to steal a Portuguese shipment of jewels, Jacquotte realizes this might be their only chance to escape and somehow secure a better future for themselves. Content warnings for experienced racism and misogyny, including use of racist slurs, sexist slurs, colorism, and depictions of slavery, allusions to an alcoholic parent and experienced child abuse, descriptions of graphic violence, injury, and death, including whippings, beatings, and physical assault, references to parental death and grief, references to off-page miscarriage, some scenes involving illness, vomit, and other medical trauma, and some fade to black sexual content. Listen, this was one of my most anticipated 2024 releases. Yes, you heard me right. That should tell you just how behind I am on my TBR, but I'm really glad I finally got a chance to get to this. This book has pretty much everything you could possibly want from an epic, swashbuckling pirate adventure. There's sword fights, there's battle on the seas, there's heists and thievery, and there's a refusal to submit to propriety and the status quo. As you might guess, this is also a really wonderful story about discovering and creating found family. This motley crew of characters can't help but become bonded to each other as they survive some very dangerous, dire, extreme circumstances. I think that was my favorite part of the story, the way it's exploring how real community is about so much more than just proximity and convenience. Just because you share space with people or come from a similar region or background doesn't mean you're automatically connected or even interested in working towards the same things. Being in community is not an incidental occurrence. It's about intentionality and choice. It's about being purposeful in the connections we make, in the relationships we choose to nurture. It's about sharing the same goals and values and visions and decisively working together to pursue those things. On top of that, the story is exciting, it's thrilling, it's full of high-stakes action from beginning to end. There are some really great messages about fighting for the most vulnerable and risking everything for what you believe in that I think really resonate. I do think there are a few times where the story sacrifices realism for idealism, if that makes sense. There are some speeches that Jacquotte delivers to her crew that feel a bit soapboxy and sometimes borderline anachronistic. And while I don't necessarily disagree with the message or the sentiment itself, there are just moments where it feels a bit too over the top, a bit too out of place. There's also a plotline in the story about these characters trying to make a literal place for themselves in the world, a place they can call home and feel safe, which is great, but at the same time the story fails to grapple with the role that colonialism and colonial violence play plays in making such a place obtainable to begin with, which, considering the conceit of the story, feels like a strange choice. So there were some moments and ideas in the story that didn't quite land, at least for me, but I still really appreciate what the story is doing overall, and I would give it a solid 4 stars. And to cap off the month, as you might have guessed, I was inspired to listen to The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and the audiobook edition I listened to was read by the Ben Barnes. This is, of course, a classic queer novel with some surrealist horror elements to it. It's about Dorian, who discovers the power of his own exceptional beauty after being painted by Basil, a talented artist. And after being painted, he realizes that while he remains physically unchanged and seemingly untouched by age, the sacred portrait that he hides in his attic is slowly changing over time to reflect the corruption curdling deep in his soul. Content warnings for references to suicide and suicide ideation, some expressions of racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, sexism, and classism, some scenes involving hard drug use, and some depictions of graphic death and violence. This classic goes so fucking hard, and I had no idea this entire time. It fucked me up, it got under my skin, it had me fully invested from start to finish. The drama was equally chaotic and delicious. Ben Barnes' performance was off the charts. There was very little not to like. Oscar Wilde was also famously jailed for being a queer man, and they used this book as evidence in his so-called sodomy trial, which has always been so strange for me to think about because this whole time I've been thinking, surely this classic novel written in the 1800s when public queerness was outlawed can't possibly be that damning. Maybe there's undertones, maybe there's subtext, maybe there's a little hint of something. But no, it really is that gay. Like, it's no wonder he was arrested with this book as evidence. So the queerness isn't even subtext, it's just text. And there's also something really provocative about the writing itself, which is incredibly gilded, over the top, purple, self-indulgent, whatever you want to call it. That aggressively ornate approach to language is such a great match for what the story is trying to achieve thematically in philosophizing about society's obsession with beauty and youth and exuberance. And I think those ideas are even more powerful when we think about these characters as gay men, when we think about how toxic beauty standards and unattainable or unsustainable forms of body image pervasively affect gay men, even to this day. Whereas the portrait in this Wretched Beauty is more of a trans metaphor, in this original text it's more of a literal stand-in for our conceptions of beauty, how beauty is a commodity that seems to only bring quantifiable value to our lives if it's something we can own, something we can control and claim for ourselves as an asset, and also how our value as humans seems to diminish as the years progress. You know, normally I wouldn't be into a story about rich, vain, vapid white men mostly standing around and philosophizing with each other for no other reason than to hear the sound of their own voice, but there was something magnetic about the drama and the tension in this story, the lengths to which Dorian is willing to go, that just had me wrapped from the very first page. There's so much more that can be said and should be said about this classic. It's truly astounding, and it's an incredibly rich sandbox to explore, but I will leave that to the real academics, historians, and intellectuals. Of course, there are some details that have not aged especially well. The story could be a little more focused in places, but this is perhaps my favorite classic that I've read, I would say, in decades, and I would still give it 4.5 stars. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read last month. Big month for historical fiction for some reason. We'll see whether March is more of the same or whether my whims take me in a completely different direction. But if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, feel free to stop by the comments down below because I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye.